The dust hadn't settled from the stagecoach wheels before the whispers started spreading through Tombstone like wildfire across dry brush, and Teresa Reynolds knew with sinking certainty that her past had finally caught up with her in this Arizona Territory town where she'd hoped to disappear. She stepped down from the coach with her worn carpetbag clutched in both hands, her dark blonde hair tucked beneath a plain bonnet, her green eyes fixed on the weathered boardwalk ahead. The year was 1882, and Tombstone had earned its reputation as one of the roughest towns in the West, but Teresa had nowhere else to go. Her aunt had passed 3 months prior, leaving her a small boarding house on the edge of town, and it was either come here or starve back in St. Louis, where everyone knew her shame. "That her?" a woman's voice carried from the general store porch. "Must be. Mary wrote that her niece was coming from Missouri." "Did you hear what happened? She was with another man, left her intended standing at the altar when they found out." Teresa's fingers tightened on her bag, but she kept walking. The truth was far more complicated than these strangers could know, but truth rarely mattered when reputation was at stake. She'd been engaged to Charles Morrison, a banker's son with a cruel streak he hid well behind his charming smile. When she'd discovered he was already married with a wife back east, she'd broken the engagement immediately. But Charles had been vindictive, spreading rumors that she'd been unfaithful, that she'd been carrying on with a railroad worker, that she was ruined goods. Her own mother had turned her back, and when Aunt Mary's letter had arrived offering her a fresh start, Teresa had fled with what little she had left. The boarding house stood at the end of Allen Street, a 2-story structure that had seen better days but appeared structurally sound. The sign hanging crooked above the door read, "Mary's Rest." Teresa would need to change that, though she hadn't decided to what yet. She climbed the front steps, retrieved the key from the lawyer's envelope, and let herself inside. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows. The front room held a desk for checking in guests, a sitting area with worn furniture, and a staircase leading to the upper floor where 6 small rooms awaited travelers. The ground floor had 2 more rooms, a kitchen, and what appeared to be a small private quarter that must have been her aunt's. It was more than Teresa had dared hope for, even if it needed considerable work. She spent the rest of that day scrubbing and sweeping, trying not to think about the whispers that would be circulating through every saloon and shop in town by now. By evening, her back ached and her hands were raw, but the front room at least looked presentable. She'd found linens in a chest upstairs and made up the bed in what would become her own room. Tomorrow she'd tackle the kitchen and see about getting supplies. Sleep came hard that first night. The sounds of Tombstone after dark were different from St. Louis, wilder and more dangerous. Gunshots echoed in the distance and raucous laughter spilled from the saloons on the main street. Teresa lay in the darkness and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here. But where else could she have gone? At least here, no one knew the full story. At least here, she could start over. The next morning dawned clear and hot as most days did in the Arizona Territory. Teresa dressed in her simplest work dress and headed into town to the general store, her head held high despite the stares that followed her. She needed flour, coffee, sugar, and various other supplies to make the boarding house functional. The store owner, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, was polite enough as he tallied her purchases, but his wife watched from behind the counter with suspicious eyes. "You planning to open Mary's place back up?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes, madam. I hope to have it ready for guests within the week." The older woman's lips pressed into a thin line. This town can be particular about who they do business with. The implication hung in the air like gun smoke. Teresa met her gaze steadily. "I'm a good worker, and I keep a clean establishment. That's all anyone needs to know about me." She paid for her supplies and arranged to have them delivered, then walked back outside into the blazing morning sun. Across the street, a group of women clustered together, their heads bent in conversation. When they noticed Teresa looking, they scattered like startled quail. Teresa sighed and started back toward the boarding house. That's when she first saw him. He rode into town on a massive bay horse, sitting tall in the saddle with an ease that spoke of years spent in rough country. Even from a distance, Teresa could see he was built like the mountains he apparently called home, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle. His hair was dark and hung past his collar, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin and leather, and a rifle rested in the scabbard at his knee. He looked like something from another time, wild and untamed, more animal than civilized man. The mountain man guided his horse to the hitching post outside the surveyor's office and dismounted with fluid grace despite his size. He had to be well over 6 feet tall, with arms that looked capable of wrestling a bear. Teresa found herself staring and quickly looked away, hurrying down the street toward home. Men like that were dangerous in their own way, even if it wasn't the same danger Charles Morrison had presented. Over the next few days, Teresa worked from dawn until dusk to prepare the boarding house. She scrubbed every surface, washed all the linens, repaired broken shutters, and painted the front door a fresh coat of blue. The physical labor was exhausting but satisfying, and it kept her mind occupied. She tried not to think about the continued whispers that followed her every time she ventured into town, or the way certain shopkeepers suddenly found themselves too busy to help her when she entered their establishments. On the 4th day, she was in the general store again, purchasing lamp oil and candles, when 3 women entered behind her. She recognized one as Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, and the other 2 were presumably her friends. They didn't acknowledge Teresa directly, but their voices carried clearly through the small space. "I heard she was caught in a hotel room with a married man," one whispered, loud enough to be heard. "Shameful. And now she thinks she can just come here and set up business like nothing happened. Someone should tell her that decent folks won't patronize an establishment run by a fallen woman." Teresa's hands shook as she counted out coins for her purchase. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them the truth, but she knew it wouldn't matter. People believed what they wanted to believe, and a woman alone was always guilty until proven innocent, if she could be proven innocent at all. Mr. Henderson at least had the grace to look embarrassed as he took her money. "Don't mind them," he said quietly. "Town gossips always need something to talk about. It'll blow over." But Teresa wasn't so sure. She gathered her purchases and headed for the door, keeping her eyes down. As she stepped outside, she collided hard with something that felt like a brick wall. Strong hands caught her arms, steadying her before she could fall, and she looked up to find herself staring into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. It was the mountain man. Up close, he was even more imposing. He towered over her 5'5" frame, his shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun. His face was weathered and tanned, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into bright horizons. But those eyes themselves were surprisingly kind, a startling blue that seemed out of place in such a rough face. "Pardon me, madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "Didn't see you coming out." "No, it was my fault. I wasn't watching where I was going." Teresa stepped back, acutely aware that people were staring at them now. The last thing she needed was more gossip about inappropriate behavior. The mountain man seemed to sense her discomfort. He touched the brim of his hat politely and stepped aside, letting her pass. But as she hurried away, she felt his gaze following her down the street. His name was Daniel Ashford, though most people called him Ash or simply the Mountain Man. He'd been living in the Dragoon Mountains east of Tombstone for the better part of 5 years, trapping and hunting and occasionally bringing furs and meat into town to trade. He kept to himself mostly, which suited him fine. He'd come west after the war between the states, looking for peace and solitude after too many years of violence and death. The mountains gave him that, along with a hard but honest living. He'd been in the surveyor's office arranging to file a claim on a piece of land near his camp when he'd heard the women talking in the general store next door. The walls were thin, and their voices had carried clearly through the gaps in the boards. He'd heard every cruel word they'd said about the young woman with the green eyes and determined expression. Daniel had seen enough cruelty in his life to recognize it in others. Those women didn't know anything about that girl except gossip and rumor, but they were ready to crucify her based on whispers. It had made his jaw clench with anger, and when he'd stepped outside and literally run into her, he'd seen the pain in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide. She was a pretty thing, though she seemed to be doing her best to hide that too. Her dress was plain and practical, her hair pulled back severely, no adornment or frill about her. But her eyes were striking, a deep green like pine forests, and her face had a delicate beauty despite the exhaustion that lined it. She looked like someone who'd been fighting a hard battle and losing. Daniel had learned long ago not to get involved in town business. He came to Tombstone when necessary, conducted his affairs, and left as quickly as possible. The noise and crowds and constant human drama set his teeth on edge after years of mountain solitude. But something about that woman stuck with him as he finished his business and loaded his pack horse with supplies for the return trip. He was preparing to mount up when he heard raised voices from down the street. A group of men stood outside the Crystal Palace saloon, and they were talking loud enough that half the town could probably hear them. "I'm just saying it ain't right, her trying to open that boarding house. What kind of message does it send, letting a woman like that run a business? Maybe we should make it clear she ain't welcome here. Could always have a little accident. Place like that, old wooden building, one spark and it'd go up like kindling." Daniel's hands stilled on the saddle horn. He looked down the street toward where he knew the boarding house stood at the end of Allen Street. Then he looked back at the men, recognizing a few of them as troublemakers and drunks. They probably wouldn't actually do anything, just puffing themselves up with whiskey courage. But probably wasn't the same as certainly. He should leave. This wasn't his concern. The woman was a stranger to him, and he had no stake in whatever drama she'd brought with her to Tombstone. He had a long ride ahead, and supplies that needed to get back to his camp before they spoiled in the heat. But the memory of those green eyes haunted with pain kept him standing there, and the memory of another woman, long ago, who'd been destroyed by cruel gossip and vicious rumors while good men stood by and did nothing. Daniel cursed under his breath, tied his horses to the rail, and walked toward the men outside the saloon. They saw him coming and fell silent. Most people did when Daniel approached. He'd learned early that his size intimidated folks, and he'd also learned how to use that to his advantage when necessary. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that particular flatness that preceded violence, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." The apparent ringleader, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, puffed up his chest. "Weren't talking to you, mountain man. This is town business. Sounded like you were talking about burning down a boarding house with a woman inside. That makes it my business. Makes it everyone's business. We weren't serious. Just talking." Daniel let the silence stretch, his blue eyes cold as winter ice. "See that you keep it to just talking. Because if anything happens to that place or that woman, I'm going to assume you boys were involved, and I'll come looking for you." The pockmarked man swallowed hard. His friends had suddenly found the dirt at their feet very interesting. "Like I said, we was just talking. No harm meant." "Good. Keep it that way." Daniel turned and walked back to his horses, aware of the stares from every direction. He just made himself the subject of gossip now, too, but that bothered him less than it probably should have. Let them talk. He'd be gone in 10 minutes and back in his mountains where their opinions couldn't reach him. Except he found himself riding toward the end of Allen Street instead of out of town. The boarding house came into view, looking considerably better than it had the last time he'd passed by. Fresh paint on the door, clean windows, and smoke rising from the chimney. The woman was a hard worker at least. She deserved better than what this town was giving her. Daniel dismounted in front of the building and climbed the steps to the porch. Before he could second-guess himself, he knocked on the door. Teresa heard the knock and felt her stomach clench with anxiety. She wasn't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors in her experience rarely brought good news. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer, pulling the door open to find the mountain man standing on her porch, somehow looking even larger in the confined space. "Mr. Ashford," she said, surprised she remembered his name from the brief introduction at the surveyor's office that she'd overheard. "Can I help you?" Daniel pulled his hat from his head, holding it awkwardly in his large hands. Up close, she noticed his eyes really were the most extraordinary blue, like the sky at altitude. "Madam, I wanted to warn you about something. I overheard some men in town talking about your place, making threats." Teresa's heart sank. "What kind of threats?" "The kind involving fire and accidents. They're probably just running their mouths with whiskey courage, but I thought you should know. Maybe keep a watch at night for a while." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the heat. "Thank you for telling me. I appreciate it." Daniel shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "I know it ain't my place to ask, but what did you do to make this town hate you so much? You kill somebody?" A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "Nothing so dramatic. I had the audacity to break an engagement when I discovered my intended was already married. He spread rumors about me being unfaithful to save his own reputation. That's all. That's my great sin." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a softening around his eyes. "So you did the right thing and got punished for it." "That seems to be how the world works, Mr. Ashford. Call me Daniel, or Ash, most folks do." He stood there another moment, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "Look, I live up in the Dragoons, come to town maybe once a month, but if you need help, if those men come around bothering you, you send word to the surveyor's office. Sam knows how to reach me." Teresa blinked in surprise. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. Don't need to know you to see you're getting a raw deal, and I don't like bullies, whether they're picking on men or women." He settled his hat back on his head. "You take care, madam, and watch yourself." He turned to leave, and Teresa found herself calling after him. "Daniel?" He paused and looked back. "Thank you, really. It's been a long time since anyone stood up for me." Something in his expression gentled further. "You're welcome, Teresa." He'd used her first name, though she hadn't given it to him. He must have heard it in town. Somehow, coming from him in that deep rumble of a voice, it sounded different. Not disrespectful or overly familiar, but almost protective. Teresa watched him ride away, sitting tall in his saddle like some figure from an old legend, and felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope, maybe, or possibly something more dangerous. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Teresa managed to open the boarding house for business, though guests were few and far between. The occasional drifter or traveling merchant would stay a night or two, drawn by her reasonable rates and clean rooms. It wasn't enough to thrive, but it was enough to survive, and for now that was sufficient. The whispers continued, of course. Women crossed the street when they saw her coming. Men either ignored her completely or looked at her with expressions that made her skin crawl, as if her supposed fall from grace made her fair game for their advances. She held her head high and kept working, determined not to let them drive her away. True to Daniel's warning, there was one night when she woke to the smell of smoke. She rushed outside to find a small fire burning in a pile of trash that had been pushed against the side of her building. She managed to put it out with buckets of water from the well before it could spread, but it shook her badly. Someone had actually tried to burn her out. The next day, she walked to the surveyor's office and left a message for Daniel Ashford, just 3 words. You were right. She didn't know if he'd even received the message or if he'd care if he did. But 2 days later, she was working in the kitchen when she heard a commotion outside. She went to investigate and found Daniel standing on her porch, and 3 men on the ground in front of the building looking considerably worse for wear. She recognized them as the ones who'd been talking outside the saloon. "These fellows have something to say to you," Daniel said, his voice carrying that dangerous flatness again. The pockmarked man spat blood into the dirt. "We're sorry about the fire. Won't happen again." "You're certain about that?" Daniel asked, looming over them like a vengeful god. "Yes, we're certain. We'll leave her alone." "Good. Now get out of here before I change my mind about letting you walk away." The 3 men scrambled to their feet and hurried off, casting fearful glances back over their shoulders. Daniel watched them go, then turned to Teresa. "They won't bother you again." Teresa stared at him, torn between gratitude and concern. "Did you hurt them badly?" "Nothing that won't heal, and nothing they didn't deserve." He flexed his right hand, and she noticed his knuckles were bruised and split. "But violence ain't a permanent solution. You're still going to have trouble in this town, Teresa. These people have made up their minds about you." "So what am I supposed to do? Run again? I've got nowhere else to go." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes studying her face. "How attached are you to running a boarding house?" "Not particularly. It's just all I have." "What if I offered you something else?" Teresa's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Daniel took off his hat and ran a hand through his long, dark hair, clearly uncomfortable. "I've got a claim up in the Dragoons. Good land, fresh water, sheltered valley. I'm planning to build a proper cabin there, maybe run some cattle. It's hard work for one person, and lonely besides. I could use help, and you could use a safe place away from all this gossip and cruelty." "Are you offering me a job or something else?" His cheeks colored beneath his beard. "I'm offering you whatever you're willing to accept." Work, if you want work. Marriage, if you want something more permanent. I know we don't know each other well, but I'm a good man, Teresa. I won't hurt you or betray you, and I sure as hell won't let anyone else hurt you either. Teresa felt her heart pounding. This was insane. She barely knew this man. He was offering her marriage after what, 3 conversations? It was the kind of impulsive decision that could ruin her life even more thoroughly than it was already ruined. But then again, what life did she have here? Scraping by on occasional guests while the whole town whispered about her, living in fear of the next fire, the next threat, the next humiliation. At least in the mountains with Daniel, she'd have peace and safety, and maybe, possibly something more. Why, she asked, why would you make such an offer to someone like me? Someone like you? You mean someone who did the right thing and got punished for it? Someone who works hard and doesn't complain? Someone who's brave enough to keep fighting even when the whole world seems set against her? Daniel shook his head. Teresa, you're not damaged goods, no matter what these people say. You're exactly the kind of woman a man like me would be lucky to have. Tears pricked at her eyes. No one had said anything like that to her in so long. They say I was with another man, that I'm ruined. They can say whatever they want. I know the truth. I can see the truth in your eyes. He took a step closer, his voice gentling. You don't have to decide right now. Think about it. I'll be in town for a few days getting supplies for the building project. When I'm ready to head back to the mountains, I'll come by. If you want to come with me, whether as my wife or just as help with the homestead, you're welcome. If you want to stay here and keep fighting, I'll respect that too. Teresa wiped at her eyes. And if I say yes to marriage, what would you expect from me? Same thing any husband expects from a wife, eventually. Partnership, companionship, a family, if the good Lord blesses us that way. But I'm not a brute, Teresa. I won't force anything on you. We can take time to get to know each other proper before we share a bed. I just want you to be safe and happy if possible. It was the most remarkable proposal Teresa had ever heard. Not that she had much to compare it to. Charles had proposed with flowery words and romantic gestures that had all been lies. Daniel was offering her something real, with no pretty wrapping to hide what it was. Honest work, honest protection, and the chance for honest love if they could find it together. Give me until you're ready to leave, she said. I'll have an answer for you then. Daniel nodded and settled his hat back on his head. That's all I ask. He turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope you say yes. I think you're made perfect for me, even if this town is too blind to see how special you are. He left her standing on the porch, her heart in turmoil and her mind racing with possibilities. Made perfect for him. No one had ever said such a thing to her before. She'd spent so long being told she was ruined, worthless, shameful. Could it be possible that this rough mountain man saw something in her that no one else could? That night, Teresa lay awake thinking about Daniel's offer. She tried to be practical about it, to weigh the pros and cons logically. But her heart kept overruling her head. She thought about his kind blue eyes, so at odds with his fearsome appearance. She thought about the way he'd stood up for her when no one else would. She thought about the gentleness in his voice when he'd called her special. And she thought about what her life would be like if she stayed in Tombstone. Years of struggling to maintain the boarding house while the town slowly strangled her business with gossip. Years of loneliness and suspicion. Years of being treated like something dirty that people had to tolerate but never accept. By morning, her mind was made up. She spent the next 2 days preparing. She sold the boarding house back to the lawyer who'd handled her aunt's estate, taking a loss on the sale but not caring. She packed her belongings, which weren't much, and she visited the church, something she hadn't done since arriving in Tombstone for fear of the judgment she'd find there. The priest, Father Miguel, was an older man with kind eyes. He listened to her story without interruption, then nodded thoughtfully. You wish to marry this man? Yes, Father, if he'll still have me. And you're certain this is what you want, not just an escape from your current circumstances? Teresa considered the question honestly. It's both, Father. I won't lie about that. But it's also something more. Daniel sees me as I am, not as the rumors paint me. He's offering me a chance at a real life, a real future. And I think I could make him happy too. I think we could be good for each other. Father Miguel smiled. Then I'll be happy to perform the ceremony if he agrees. Bring him to me when he's ready." On the third day, Daniel appeared at the boarding house with a wagon loaded with lumber and supplies. He tied off the reins and climbed down, approaching the porch where Teresa waited with her bags already packed. His eyes widened when he saw them. "You decided then?" "I decided. If the offer still stands, I'd like to be your wife, Daniel Ashford." The smile that spread across his face transformed him. He looked younger suddenly, and almost boyish despite his size and the weathering of his features. "The offer stands. It'll always stand. You're sure?" "I'm sure." "Then let's get you married before you change your mind." He bounded up the steps and grabbed her bags like they weighed nothing, tossing them into the wagon. "Father Miguel can do the ceremony?" "I already spoke with him. He's expecting us." They were married within the hour, standing before the altar in the small adobe church with Father Miguel presiding and two elderly parishioners serving as witnesses. Teresa wore her best dress, which wasn't saying much, and Daniel had cleaned up as best he could, brushing the trail dust from his clothes and slicking back his long hair. When Father Miguel pronounced them man and wife, Daniel kissed her gently, carefully, as if she might break. "Hello, Mrs. Ashford," he whispered against her lips. "Hello, husband." They left Tombstone that afternoon, sitting side by side on the wagon bench as Daniel guided the horses east toward the Dragoon Mountains. Teresa didn't look back. She'd spent too much of her life looking backward, dwelling on mistakes and missed chances. It was time to look forward, toward the mountains rising purple and blue against the desert sky, toward the life she was going to build with this remarkable man she'd married. The journey took 2 days, with Daniel setting an easy pace to spare the horses in the heat. They camped the first night in the foothills, and Daniel was true to his word about not forcing anything. He set up 2 separate bedrolls by the fire and respected her space, though Teresa caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her breath catch. He told her about his life during those 2 days, his voice low and steady as the wagon rolled along. He'd grown up in Missouri, not far from where she'd lived. He'd fought in the war between the states, seen terrible things, lost friends and brothers. When it was over, he couldn't settle back into ordinary life. Everything felt too small, too confining. So he'd come west looking for something he couldn't name, and found it in the mountains. "What did you find?" Teresa asked. "Peace. Purpose. A place where the only expectations on me were the ones I put on myself." He glanced at her. "But it gets lonely up there. I realized lately that peace and purpose aren't enough by themselves. A man needs someone to share it with, or it all starts feeling hollow." Teresa understood that feeling all too well. "I'm glad you came down from your mountain when you did." "So am I. Best decision I ever made." They reached his claim on the afternoon of the second day, and Teresa's breath caught at the beauty of it. The valley was small but lush by desert standards, with a creek running through it fed by mountain springs. Pine and juniper trees clustered on the slopes, and the floor of the valley had good grass for grazing. Daniel's temporary camp sat near the creek, a simple tent and fire ring, but she could see he'd already cleared the ground for a cabin and had lumber stockpiled nearby. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "It'll be even better once we get the cabin built. Should be done before winter if we work steady." He helped her down from the wagon, his hands spanning her waist easily. "I know it's not much right now, Teresa, but I promise I'll give you a proper home." "I don't need much, Daniel. I just need to feel safe. And I do with you." Something fierce and protective flashed in his blue eyes. He cupped her face in his large, calloused hand. "You'll always be safe with me. Always. No one will ever hurt you again." Then he kissed her, deeper than before, and Teresa felt heat bloom in her core. She'd been with Charles a few times before she discovered his deception, fumbling encounters that had left her feeling used and empty. This was different. When Daniel touched her, she felt cherished, wanted, precious. That night, beside the campfire under a blanket of stars more numerous than she'd ever seen in town, Teresa gave herself to her husband completely. Daniel was gentle with her, taking his time, making sure she found pleasure before seeking his own. His body was magnificent, all hard muscle and power, but he controlled that power carefully, using his strength to protect rather than dominate. When they finally came together, Teresa felt something shift deep inside her, like a lock clicking open on a door she'd thought was sealed forever. Afterward, lying wrapped in his arms with her head on his broad chest, she whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me. The real me, not what everyone else decided I was." Daniel's arms tightened around her. "I see you, Teresa, and you're perfect. You're made perfect for me." Those words again. They settled into her heart like a benediction, healing wounds she'd carried for too long. The weeks that followed were the hardest work Teresa had ever done, but also the most satisfying. She and Daniel rose with the sun each morning and worked until dark, building their cabin log by log. Daniel did the heavy lifting and the skilled carpentry, but Teresa helped with everything she could. She learned to notch logs, mix chinking, split shakes for the roof. Her hands blistered and then calloused. Her muscles ached in new ways every night, but she'd never felt more alive. They talked while they worked, sharing stories and dreams. Daniel had a dry sense of humor that surprised her, and he loved hearing her laugh. Teresa found herself opening up to him in ways she'd never opened up to anyone, telling him about her childhood, her fears, her hopes for the future. "I always wanted children," she admitted one afternoon as they were setting rafters, "a whole house full of them. But after what happened with Charles, I thought that dream was dead." "Why would it be dead?" Daniel asked from his perch on the wall. "Because what man would want to raise a family with a woman everyone says is ruined?" Daniel climbed down and crossed to where she stood. He tipped her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "I want to raise a family with you, as many children as the good Lord sees fit to bless us with, and anyone who says you're ruined is a damn fool who doesn't deserve your attention." Tears pricked Teresa's eyes. "You really mean that?" "I never say things I don't mean. You want babies, Teresa? We'll make babies. We'll fill this valley with little ones and teach them to be strong and kind and to judge people by their character instead of by gossip." She kissed him there in the hot sun, surrounded by sawdust and wood shavings, and felt her heart overflow with love for this man who'd given her back her future. The cabin was finished by October, just as the nights began turning cold. It was a solid structure, one large room on the ground floor with a sleeping loft above, a good fireplace, and real glass windows that Daniel had hauled all the way from Tombstone. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and their own sweat. Teresa had never been prouder of anything in her life. They spent their first night in the cabin wrapped in blankets before the fireplace, listening to the wind whisper through the pines outside. Daniel held her close, his large body a wall of warmth at her back. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I've ever been." "Good. That's all I want, to keep you safe and happy for the rest of our lives. You've already given me so much more than that. You gave me back my dignity, my hope, myself." Daniel turned her in his arms so she faced him, his blue eyes serious in the firelight. "You were never lost, Teresa. You just needed someone to remind you of who you really are. Someone strong enough to see past the lies to the truth underneath. And you're that someone. I'm trying to be. Every day I'm trying to be the man you deserve." Teresa smiled and kissed him softly. "You already are." Winter came to the Dragoons with surprising force. Snow fell in the high country and ice formed on the edges of the creek in the mornings. But the cabin stayed warm and cozy, and Teresa found she didn't mind being snowed in with only Daniel for company. They spent those long winter evenings by the fire, talking and laughing and making love, building the foundation of their marriage day by day. Daniel taught her to shoot, patient and thorough in his instruction. "You need to be able to protect yourself when I'm out hunting or checking the trap lines," he explained. By spring, Teresa could hit a target at 50 yards with the rifle and wasn't half bad with the pistol either. She taught him to read better. He could manage basic reading but had never had much formal education. Teresa had been a schoolteacher's daughter and knew her letters well. They spent many evenings with her helping him work through the books she'd brought from St. Louis, his head bent close to hers as he sounded out difficult words. "Why are you bothering with this?" he asked one night, frustrated with a particularly complex passage. "I've gotten by just fine without being able to read fancy books." "Because knowledge is power," Teresa said, "and because I want our children to have a father who can read to them at bedtime. And because you have a fine mind, Daniel Ashford, and it deserves to be challenged and expanded." He kissed her soundly. "You're too good for me." "Nonsense. We're exactly right for each other." Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Daniel started building corrals for the small herd of cattle he planned to acquire, and Teresa planted a garden near the house. She'd brought seeds from Tombstone, and she coaxed vegetables and herbs from the mountain soil with patient determination. It was in April that Teresa realized she was pregnant. She'd missed her monthly courses and had been feeling sick in the mornings. When she told Daniel, he literally picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy. "A baby! We're having a baby!" He set her down carefully, suddenly concerned. "Are you all right? Should you be resting? What do you need?" Teresa laughed at his anxious expression. "I'm fine. Women have been having babies since the dawn of time. I'm healthy and strong, and I have you to take care of me. Everything will be fine. I'm going to be a father." Daniel's expression was one of awe and terror mixed together. "I don't know how to be a father, Teresa." "Neither do I know how to be a mother. We'll figure it out together." He pulled her close, one large hand resting gently on her still flat belly. "I'm going to protect you both with everything I have. I swear it. I know you will." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Teresa bloomed, her body changing in ways that fascinated and sometimes frightened her. Daniel was attentive and protective, sometimes overly so. He tried to stop her from doing any heavy work, which Teresa found both endearing and frustrating. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she told him after he'd insisted on carrying water from the creek that she was perfectly capable of hauling herself. "I need to stay active or I'll go mad cooped up in the cabin." "But what if you hurt yourself? What if you hurt the baby?" "Daniel," she took his face in her hands, "I appreciate your concern. I love that you want to protect us. But you have to trust me to know my own limits. I won't do anything that puts our child at risk." He sighed and nodded, though she could tell it went against every protective instinct he had. That was part of loving him, Teresa realized. He was a natural guardian, built to defend and shelter. She had to let him do that in the ways he needed to, while also maintaining her own independence. In September, as the leaves began turning gold in the high country, Teresa's labor began. Daniel had ridden to Tombstone 2 weeks prior and convinced the town's midwife, Mrs. Chen, to come stay with them until the baby arrived. She was a practical Chinese woman who'd seen hundreds of births and wasn't impressed by Daniel's size or fierce reputation. "You, big man, boil water and stay out of the way," she ordered when Teresa's contractions began. "Let me do my job." Daniel looked agonized. "I can't just leave her." "You can and you will. Birthing room is no place for nervous fathers." Teresa, despite her pain, managed a smile. "Do as she says, Daniel. I'll be fine." The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. Daniel paced outside the cabin like a caged mountain lion, wearing a path in the dirt. Every cry from inside made him flinch. Several times he tried to burst in, only to be firmly escorted back out by Mrs. Chen. Finally, as the sun was setting on that second day, he heard the sound he'd been waiting for. A baby's cry. Moments later, Mrs. Chen opened the door with a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Ashford. Big, healthy boy, just like his father." Daniel pushed past her carefully and entered the cabin. Teresa lay in their bed looking exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. When she saw him, her face lit up with joy. "Come meet your son." Daniel approached slowly, almost reverently. When he looked down at the baby, his breath caught. The child was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to already be turning blue. He was perfect. "Can I hold him?" Daniel asked. Teresa smiled. "He's your son. Of course you can." Daniel took the baby with extreme care, his large hands surprisingly gentle. The infant seemed impossibly tiny in his arms, fragile and precious beyond measure. Daniel looked down at his son, and Teresa saw tears streaming down his bearded cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me a family, for giving me everything I never knew I needed. Thank you for giving me a home, a real home, not just a place to live, but somewhere I belong, someone I belong with." They named the baby David, after Daniel's father who died in the war. Little David Ashford proved to be a healthy, happy baby with a set of lungs that could wake the dead when he wanted feeding. Daniel was besotted, spending every spare moment holding his son, talking to him, showing him around the valley. He can't understand you yet, Teresa pointed out with amusement as Daniel explained the finer points of cattle ranching to their 2-month-old son. He'll remember when he's older. It's important to start the education early. Teresa just shook her head and smiled. Daniel was going to be one of those fathers who was wrapped around his children's fingers from day one. She couldn't wait to see him with a house full of little ones. Winter came again, and the Ashford family settled into their routines. Teresa marveled at how different this winter was from the last. Then, it had been just her and Daniel learning each other. Now they had David, who filled the cabin with sounds and smells and an overwhelming sense of life. The exhaustion of caring for an infant was real, but so was the joy. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside and David slept peacefully in the cradle Daniel had carved with his own hands, Teresa and Daniel sat before the fire, wrapped in each other's arms. "Do you ever miss town?" Daniel asked. "Other people, society, all that?" Teresa considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss having other women to talk to. I think I'll miss it more as David gets older and needs playmates. But miss Tombstone specifically. Miss the gossip and the judgment and the cruelty? Never. Not for a single moment. We could go somewhere else, find a different town, one where people don't know your history. Maybe someday when the children are older. But for now I'm happy here. This valley, this cabin, you and David, that's all I need." Daniel kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Teresa. More than I ever thought I could love anyone." "I love you too. You saved me, you know. Not just from Tombstone, but from giving up on myself. You saw something in me worth saving. I saw the woman you really are, strong, brave, beautiful inside and out. I'm the lucky one, Teresa. You could have had any man, but you chose me. You're wrong about that. I couldn't have had any man. They all believed the lies about me. Only you saw the truth. Only you were willing to look past the gossip to who I really am. That's why I chose you, Daniel. Because you chose me first, when no one else would." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to their son's gentle breathing. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, but inside, they were warm and safe, and together. The years flowed by like the creek through their valley, steady and sure. David grew into a sturdy little boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick smile. When he was 3, he became a big brother to twin girls, Emily and Emma, who had Teresa's green eyes and Daniel's dark hair. The cabin expanded with the family, Daniel adding rooms and a proper second story. Teresa started a small school in the valley, teaching not only her own children, but also the children of the few other families who'd homesteaded in the area. Daniel's prediction about her being a natural teacher proved accurate. She had patience and creativity, and she loved watching young minds expand and grow. Daniel built up a successful cattle operation, selling beef to the mining camps and the army fort. His reputation as an honest dealer and a hard worker spread, and men came from miles around, seeking his advice on ranching in the high country. He remained fiercely protective of his family, but he'd learned to channel that protective energy into productive work rather than violence. They made occasional trips to Tombstone for supplies, and over time, the gossip about Teresa faded. New scandals replaced the old ones, as they always did. Some of the people who'd been cruelest to her had the grace to look ashamed when they saw her now, prosperous and happy with her handsome husband and beautiful children. Others still whispered, but Teresa found she didn't care anymore. Their opinions had no power over her. One day, when Teresa was in the general store with young David helping her carry packages, Mrs. Henderson approached. The woman who'd been one of her earliest tormentors now looked older and diminished somehow. "Mrs. Ashford," she said hesitantly, "I wanted to say something to you. I wanted to apologize." Teresa looked at her in surprise. "Apologize? For the things I said about you? The way I treated you when you first came to town? I believed the gossip without ever trying to learn the truth. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry." Teresa considered the apology, then nodded graciously. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Henderson. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. You've done well for yourself. Your husband and children are a credit to you. Thank you. I've been blessed beyond measure." After Mrs. Henderson left, David tugged on Teresa's skirt. "Mama, why did that lady say sorry?" Teresa knelt down to his level. "Because she made a mistake once, and saying sorry is how we try to make things right when we've hurt someone." "Did she hurt you?" "Yes, but I forgave her. That's what we do when people are truly sorry." "Papa says forgiveness is for strong people." Teresa smiled. "Your papa is a wise man." That evening she told Daniel about the encounter. He listened quietly, then pulled her into his arms. "You handled that with more grace than she deserved." "Maybe. But holding on to anger hurts me more than it hurts her. I have too much to be grateful for to waste energy on old wounds." "When did you get so wise?" "I learned it from a mountain man who saw past rumors to the truth underneath, who taught me that I was worth more than the world said I was, who gave me a life beyond anything I dared dream." Daniel kissed her deeply. "That mountain man sounds like he knows a good thing when he sees it." "He does. And so do I." More years passed. David grew tall and strong like his father, though he had his mother's gentle nature. The twins became beautiful young women, spirited and independent. There were more children, 3 more sons who filled the valley with laughter and noise. The cabin became a house, and the house became the heart of a thriving homestead. Daniel's hair turned silver at the temples, and his beard grew more gray than dark. But he was still strong, still vital, still the fierce protector he'd always been. Teresa's face gained lines around her eyes and mouth, marks of years spent laughing and smiling. She was more beautiful to Daniel at 40 than she'd been at 23, seasoned by life and love. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Teresa by taking her back to the spot where they'd first camped on the journey to the valley. He'd arranged for the older children to watch the younger ones, and he'd packed supplies for a night under the stars like they'd spent when they were newlyweds. They sat by the fire, after dinner, leaning against each other in comfortable silence. Teresa looked up at the stars, the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their love. "Do you remember that first night?" she asked. "How nervous I was." "You hit it well. I was the one who was nervous, worried I'd do something wrong and scare you off." Teresa laughed. "I can't imagine you being nervous about anything." "I'm nervous every day. Nervous that I'm not being a good enough husband, a good enough father. Nervous that I'll fail you somehow." She turned to face him, taking his bearded face in her hands. "Daniel Ashford, you listen to me. You are the best man I've ever known. The best husband, the best father, the best partner anyone could ask for. You've given me a life I never dreamed was possible. You've loved me through everything, supported me, protected me, encouraged me to be more than I thought I could be. If I'm strong now, it's because you believed in me when no one else did. You were always strong, Teresa. You just needed someone to remind you. Then thank God that someone was you." She kissed him softly. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of pain and doubt, all of it was worth it to end up here with you." Daniel pulled her close. "They whispered that you'd been with another man, that you were ruined, worthless, damaged beyond repair. But I knew the truth from the moment I saw you. You weren't ruined. You were perfect. Made perfect for me. And you were made perfect for me. My mountain man. My protector. My love." They made love under the stars that night like they had 20 years before, still finding joy and passion in each other after 2 decades of marriage. Some loves burned hot and fast, consuming everything in their path before burning out. But the love between Daniel and Teresa was different. It was the slow, steady burn of a well-tended fire, warm and constant, capable of lasting a lifetime. The years continued their march. The children grew and married and had children of their own. David brought home a sweet girl from the valley over and married her in the little church that had been built near the homestead. The twins married brothers from a neighboring ranch, staying close enough to visit regularly. The younger boys were still finding their way, but Teresa had no doubt they'd make her proud. Daniel and Teresa grew old together, their bodies slowing but their minds and hearts still sharp. They sat on the porch of their house on warm evenings, watching their grandchildren play in the valley they'd built together, and counted their blessings. Who would have thought, Teresa mused one evening, that the girl who arrived in Tombstone with nothing but shame and a carpet bag would end up with all this? I thought it. From the moment I saw you, I knew you were meant for something better than what that town was giving you. You saw what no one else could see. Because I was looking with my heart instead of my ears. Best decision I ever made." Teresa reached over and took his hand, still large and strong despite his age. "The whispers don't matter anymore. They never really did. All that mattered was this: us, our family, our love. Our legacy," Daniel added, watching their grandchildren. "We built something good here, Teresa. Something that'll outlast us. We built it together. That's the important part." As the sun set over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Daniel and Teresa sat in the comfortable silence of two people who'd shared a lifetime. They'd faced hardship and overcome it. They'd been tested and emerged stronger. They'd loved deeply and been loved in return. The girl who'd been whispered about as ruined had become a respected matriarch. The mountain man who'd lived alone had become a beloved husband, father, and grandfather. Together, they'd proven that the opinions of small-minded people meant nothing compared to the truth of two hearts joined in genuine love. Years later, when Teresa was in her 60s, she was approached by a young woman in Tombstone during one of their increasingly rare trips to town. The woman was crying, clutching a small bag, looking lost and desperate. "Mrs. Ashford?" the woman asked hesitantly. "You're Teresa Ashford, aren't you?" "I am. Can I help you?" "I've heard stories about you, about how you came to town and everyone whispered about you, said terrible things, but you survived it. You built a good life despite what they said." The young woman wiped at her tears. "I need to know how you did it, because everyone is saying terrible things about me now, and I don't know what to do." Teresa looked at this young woman and saw herself all those years ago, frightened and alone and desperate for someone to believe in her. She reached out and took the woman's hands. "What's your name?" Sarah Mitchell." "Well, Sarah, the first thing you need to know is that what other people say about you doesn't define who you are. Only you can decide that. The second thing is that you're stronger than you know. And the third thing is that somewhere out there, there's someone who will see the real you past all the gossip and lies, someone who will recognize your worth when no one else does." "How do I find them?" "You don't. You just keep being true to yourself, and they'll find you." Teresa smiled. "And in the meantime, you work hard, you hold your head high, and you don't let the whispers steal your spirit." Sarah looked at her with hope dawning in her eyes. "Do you really believe that?" "I know it. I lived it, and you can too." Teresa invited Sarah to visit their homestead, if she ever needed help or just someone to talk to. She also quietly spread the word through her network of friends and family that Sarah was under her protection. The whispers about the young woman didn't stop immediately, but they lost their power. People knew that Teresa Ashford didn't tolerate cruelty and that she had the backing of one of the most respected families in the territory. Sarah eventually found her own mountain man, a gentle prospector who saw past her reputation to the good woman beneath. Teresa attended their wedding with Daniel by her side, smiling at the completion of the circle. She'd been saved by kindness, and now she was passing that kindness forward. It was the best kind of legacy she could imagine. As Teresa entered her 70s, her health began to decline. She'd lived a hard life, and her body bore the marks of it. But her spirit remained strong, and she faced the reality of mortality with the same courage she'd faced everything else. Daniel was constantly at her side, caring for her with the same fierce devotion he'd shown for nearly 50 years. "I'm not afraid," she told him one evening as they sat together watching the sunset. "I've had a good life, Daniel. A wonderful life. More than I ever deserved." "You deserved every bit of it and more," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. Loving you has been the greatest honor of my life. And being loved by you saved me from a dark path I was walking, from giving up on myself and the world. You showed me that there was still good in this world, still kindness and honor and real love. You gave me hope when I had none." "We saved each other," Daniel corrected. "I was dying up in those mountains, just didn't know it, dying of loneliness and purposelessness. You gave me a reason to come down from my solitary existence. You gave me a life worth living." Teresa smiled and squeezed his hand. "Then we both got what we needed most. How lucky we've been." Teresa passed quietly in her sleep one night with the changing of the seasons, Daniel holding her hand. She was 73 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her dearly. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people from all over the territory, all coming to pay respects to a woman who'd lived with grace and dignity despite every attempt to break her. Daniel stood at her graveside, this old mountain man with silver hair and weathered face, tears streaming freely down his cheeks. His son stood beside him, supporting him physically and emotionally. His daughters wept, mourning the mother who'd taught them to be strong. His grandchildren didn't fully understand yet what they'd lost, but they would in time. After everyone else had left, after the last words had been said and the last flowers laid, Daniel remained alone by the grave. He knelt down stiffly, his old knees protesting, and placed his large hand on the fresh earth. "They whispered that you were ruined," he said softly. "They said you'd been with another man, that you were worthless and shameful. But I knew better. From the first moment I saw you, I knew. You were made perfect for me, Teresa, and I was made perfect for you. We fit together like two pieces of a puzzle, and together we made something beautiful." He stayed there until the sun set, talking to her about their children, their grandchildren, their life together, remembering the good times and even the hard times, because all of it had been part of their story. Finally, as darkness fell and the stars began to appear overhead, he stood slowly. "I'll see you again," he promised, "not too long now. And when I do, I'm going to hold you in my arms and never let go." Daniel lived 3 more years, long enough to see another great-grandchild born, long enough to pass on his knowledge of the land to his grandsons, long enough to tell the story of how he'd met Teresa over and over to anyone who would listen. He wanted everyone to know the truth about her, not the lies that had been whispered in Tombstone all those years ago, but the real story of a brave woman who'd been wronged and a man who'd been smart enough to see her true worth. When Daniel finally passed, also peacefully in his sleep, his children buried him beside Teresa in the little cemetery near the homestead. The headstone read, "Daniel Ashford, 1835-1910, Teresa Reynolds Ashford, 1859-1932. Together forever below." That, at the request of their children, was inscribed a single line: "She was made perfect for me." The homestead remained in the family for generations, passed down through David's line. The story of Daniel and Teresa became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It became a reminder that love could triumph over adversity, that kindness was stronger than cruelty, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with someone being brave enough to see the truth when everyone else was content to believe lies. The valley still stood, green and lush, watered by the same creek that had drawn Daniel there so long ago. The house had been updated and expanded over the years, but the core structure remained, built by Daniel's own hands with Teresa working beside him. On quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines just right, some family members swore they could still hear the echoes of laughter from those early years when a mountain man and a woman fleeing gossip had built a love that would last for eternity. In Tombstone, the old boarding house where Teresa had briefly tried to make a life was long gone, replaced by newer structures. Few people remembered the scandal that had once consumed the town's gossips, but in the museums and historical societies, careful researchers occasionally came across references to Teresa Reynolds, the woman who'd been driven from town by whispers and had gone on to become one of the founding matriarchs of a prominent ranching family. Some of those researchers, reading between the lines of old letters and diary entries, pieced together the truth of what had really happened. They wrote papers about the injustice she'd faced, about the strength she'd shown, about the love that had saved her. But those academic works, valuable as they were, could never fully capture the reality of what Daniel and Teresa had shared. The small moments of tenderness, the quiet nights by the fire, the laughter and tears and everyday joys of building a life together. The way Daniel's eyes had always lit up when Teresa entered a room, even after 50 years of marriage. The way Teresa had always reached for Daniel's hand when she needed comfort or strength. The way they'd moved together like dancers who knew every step by heart. That kind of love couldn't be contained in historical records or academic papers. It could only be felt and lived and passed down through stories told by firelight to children and grandchildren eager to hear about the mountain man who'd saved their grandmother and the brave woman who'd saved him right back. And so the legacy continued, generation after generation, each couple in the family striving to build a love as strong and true as the one that had started it all. Some succeeded better than others, but all of them understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. They were part of a love story that had begun with whispers and ended with triumph, with two people who'd been brave enough to see past lies to truth, past reputation to character, past the superficial to the essential. The mountains stood eternal, witnesses to it all. The creek kept flowing year after year, season after season. And somewhere, in the wind that whistled through the valley, if you listened carefully on certain nights, you could almost hear a deep voice saying, "She's made perfect for me," followed by a woman's gentle laughter, warm with love and happiness and the contentment of a life well lived. The story of Daniel and Teresa Ashford became more than just family history. It became a reminder that in a world quick to judge and condemn, there would always be those brave enough to look deeper. That love could bloom in the most unexpected places between the most unexpected people. That a woman dismissed as ruined could become a pillar of strength. That a solitary mountain man could become the loving patriarch of a dynasty. That two broken people could come together and make each other whole. Their great-great-grandchildren still worked the land Daniel had claimed over a century earlier. They raised cattle and horses, grew crops, and taught their own children the values that Daniel and Teresa had instilled: hard work, integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the whole world seemed set against you. Every year on the anniversary of Daniel and Teresa's wedding, the family gathered at the cemetery to place flowers on their graves and tell the old stories again. The young ones would hear about the whispers in Tombstone, about how Daniel had stood up for a woman he barely knew, about the proposal that had changed everything. They'd hear about the cabin built by hand, about the love that had grown deeper with every passing year, about the legacy of kindness that had rippled outward from that first brave act of seeing someone for who they truly were, rather than what others said about them. And perhaps most importantly, they'd learned that love wasn't always easy or simple or perfect, but when it was real, when it was based on mutual respect and genuine caring, when two people were willing to fight for each other and build something together, it could overcome any obstacle. Even the cruelest whispers couldn't destroy a love that strong. The sun set over the Dragoon Mountains on another day, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange, pink, and gold. In the valley below, lights began to glow in the windows of the Ashford homestead, warm and welcoming. Inside, multiple generations gathered for dinner, sharing food and conversation and love. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the echoes of a story that would never truly end. Because some loves transcend time and death, some loves become woven into the very fabric of the land itself, permanent as mountains, constant as flowing water. Daniel and Teresa's love was one of those. It had started with courage and kindness in the face of cruelty, and it had grown into something magnificent and enduring. They whispered that she'd been with another man. They whispered that she was ruined, worthless, shameful. But the mountain man knew better. He saw past the whispers to the truth underneath. He saw a woman of strength and character, brave and beautiful in all the ways that mattered. He saw someone made perfect for him, and in seeing her truly, in loving her completely, he gave her the greatest gift anyone can give another person, the gift of being fully seen and wholly accepted exactly as she was. That was their legacy. Not the land or the cattle or the house, important as those things were. Their true legacy was the example they set, the proof they provided that love could triumph over malice, that kindness could overcome cruelty, that two people committed to each other could build something that would last for generations. The story of Daniel and Teresa Ashford wasn't just a romance. It was a testament to the power of human connection, to the importance of looking past surface judgments to see the truth of a person's character. It was a reminder that we all have the power to change someone's life simply by choosing to see them clearly, to believe in them when others won't, to offer kindness when the world offers only cruelty. And it was proof that sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, two souls can recognize each other across all the noise and chaos of the world. Two people who fit together perfectly, who make each other stronger and better, who create something together that neither could have built alone. That was what the mountain man and the woman fleeing whispers had found in each other all those years ago in the Arizona territory. And that was what their descendants still celebrated, still honored, still strove to emulate in their own lives and loves. The mountains stood eternal. The creek flowed on. And the love story of Daniel and Teresa Ashford continued to inspire generation after generation, a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever felt judged, dismissed, or broken. Because their story proved that it was never too late for redemption, never too late for love, never too late to find someone who would see you truly and love you completely, exactly as you were always meant to be loved. She'd been whispered about, but he'd seen the truth. And together, they'd built something beautiful that would endure long after the whispers faded into silence. That was the power of real love. That was the legacy worth leaving. That was the story worth telling, over and over, so that no one would ever forget what two brave people had proven over a century ago in a valley in the Dragoon Mountains, that love, true love, conquers all.